So some interesting nominees there. I can't lie, it's not that close. Like, let's be real, Amari Cooper's not winning the offensive MVP of the NFC. Neither is DK Metcalf. Neither is Calvin Ridley. So they all had very impressive years, but pretty far from Aaron.
It's a miracle! Oh, yeah! What about that one? No! Unbelievable! Balotelli! Aguero! Crowd cheers. Here's Siddle. Oh, the ball is close! He's given him! He's given him! Taylor Siddle's got a hat-trick on his birthday!
Hello and welcome back to the On The Ball podcast. This is episode 102 of the show, and we are here to finish the NFL awards that we started in episode 101. Today we'll be talking about the other conference of the NFL. So episode 101, we talked about the AFC. We went through offensive and defensive MVPs, offensive, defensive, rookie MVPs, and we also went through some other awards like Coach of the Year, Signings of the Year, Game of the Year. So we're going to be doing the exact same thing today, but on the NFC side of things. So without further ado, I think I say that almost every episode, but I reckon we get straight into it, starting with the offensive MVP. Once again, like yesterday's episode, I'm going to go division by division and use that as sort of a nominee sort of situation. So we'll start with the NFC East offensive MVP. I can't lie, there weren't too many options in this division. Definitely the weakest division in the NFL this year. But the offensive MVP candidate for me is Amari Cooper. Given the catastrophe of a year it was for Dallas and they're changing quarterbacks with Dak's injury, Andy Dolan also got injured, so he had to deal with Ben DiNucci, and I actually forget the other bloke's name, but there was another guy who played one game. So he dealt with 4 different quarterbacks throughout the season. He still performed to a pretty high level, in my opinion. I have him finishing as the 17th best wide receiver for the year, which is probably about where we would have him at the start. Maybe we would have thought he would finish a little bit higher than that, but if you knew Dak was going to be injured from about week 5 onwards, you'd maybe cut him some slack. So I think he had a pretty impressive year, just given all those moving parts. 11th in receptions in the NFL, 14th in receiving yards. So I think Amari Cooper did his best in a struggling team, and I think can't be too many complaints with his performances this year. So he's the offensive MVP candidate from the NFC East, in my opinion. Moving on to the NFC North, this is a completely different story here. We are spoilt for choice, but the clear standout is Aaron Rodgers. There could be a case for Davante Adams, as in my opinion he was the best wide receiver, but a number 1 wide receiver versus in my opinion, a top 2, I don't want to spoil it, so I'll say a top 2 quarterback. It's tough to pick the wide receiver there. So I'm going with Aaron Rodgers. Most passing TDs for the year, best completion rate of anyone who had over 150 attempts, least interceptions of anyone who started at least 15 games. So pretty incredible year from him. I can't lie, I thought he was maybe on the decline in his career after the 2019 year. And in saying that, he still probably had a top 10 year, but probably was just outside that top 5. But he came back with vengeance this year, and in my opinion, he was the best quarterback on the season. Honourable mentions do have to go to Davante Adams, like I said, 18 receiving touchdowns, over 1,300 yards. He was the number 1 wide receiver in, I think, everyone's opinion. Also worth mentioning, Dalvin Cook had another cracking year, probably finished as the running back 2 behind Henry. And then Justin Jefferson, David Montgomery, Aaron Jones, Adam Thielen, Allen Robinson, and Kirk Cousins all had pretty impressive years. So I think they all deserve a mention. Moving on to the NFC South, another division that is fairly stacked, nothing compared to the NFC North in terms of individual talent. But I've actually gone with a strange one here. I reckon most people would have Kamara or Brady, but I've actually gone with Calvin Ridley. We predicted his breakout at the start of the season on this podcast, and he did certainly do that. His season was messed around a little bit with Julio Jones being injured for a lot of it. He was also injured for some of it, but he ended the year 13th in receptions, 6th in receiving yards, top 10 in receiving touchdowns, and he was also 4th in yards per game. So when he was on the park, he was one of the better wide receivers in the competition. I had him finishing as the 5th receiver. That's including tight ends. I had Kelsey as the number 4. So realistically, I had him as the number 4 wide receiver on the season, which is pretty impressive considering Atlanta didn't have the most successful of seasons. So he's probably an outside call, but I'm going to pick him as my NFC South candidate for the offensive MVP of the NFC. Honorable mentions got to go to Tom Brady. I have Tom Brady as my QB5 on the year. So for the QB5 to miss out on a divisional MVP, that's pretty rare. So condolences to him, I guess. Not that he gives a crap where I rank him. Then Kamara, I had him as the RB3 as well. So he also very unlucky to miss out. And then Mike Evans and DJ Moore both have pretty good years in their respective teams. Then finally, the NFC West. This is probably an interesting one. I think at week 10, you would have laughed if someone said this award wouldn't go to Kyler Murray or Russell Wilson, but in fact, they actually weren't too high in my final standings. I think they both missed out on the top 10, if I'm honest. So definitely, I don't know if that's a consensus opinion, but in my opinion, they definitely fell away later in the year. So I'm actually going to give the offensive MVP to DK Metcalf. He finished 7th in receiving yards, 9th in receiving touchdowns. He was just a force all year. It's pretty hard to contain someone that big and that fast. I think Jalen Ramsey's probably the only guy who could do it. I can't remember anyone else really putting much of a lockdown job on him. And yeah, he was just impressive all year. Him and Tyler Lockett are probably... I'm just saying this off the top of my head, so don't shoot me, but they're probably the best 1-2 wide receiver combo coming out of this season, you'd have to say. And then combined with Russell Wilson, it's tough to see Seattle going too far south in terms of ability in the next few years. So it's going to be interesting to see how DK Metcalf's progression goes, because I thought he had an outstanding year this year. Honourable mentions do go to Tyler Lockett, as I mentioned before. He had a killer year, and then also DeAndre Hopkins and Robert Woods for Arizona and the Rams, respectively, both had really good years. So some interesting nominees there. I can't lie, it's not that close. Like, let's be real, Amari Cooper's not winning the offensive MVP of the NFC. Neither is DK Metcalf. Neither is Calvin Ridley. So they all had very good, impressive years, but pretty far from Aaron Rodgers. And it's fair to say Devontae Adams, if he was in another division, would probably be the clear number 2 candidate for this award. So, and even Dalvin Cook would probably be number 3. So big year for the NFC North. Massive year for Aaron Rodgers, and he is my NFC offensive MVP. And just a little side note, I have him above Mahomes, so he is actually my NFL MVP for the year. So well done, Aaron Rodgers. Mr. Dilf, I don't know if he is a Dilf, he gives off Dilf vibes, I reckon, but the good-looking rooster from Green Bay, he had an absolute blinder of a year with Matt LaFleur there. Offensive schemes were pretty much unrivaled all season, and they sadly stumbled on the final hurdle like they did last year at the NFC Championship game, but I'm sure they'll be back next year, hopefully with a few more wide-out talent in Aaron Rodgers' opinion, I'm sure. And looking on the defensive side of the ball, NFC East, I've gone with Blake Martinez, the linebacker from the New York Giants. I don't know how long he was at Green Bay, actually, but he was a pretty good servant for the Green Bay Packers for a long time, and they let him go. And he moved over to New York, and he had just a very good season. Like a lot of linebackers, nothing outrageous in terms of a specific stat, but just very well-rounded in each category. His main stat would probably have to be 10th most solo tackles in the league, which is pretty impressive. But yeah, he was probably, I guess you could say, the quarterback of a very good defense there in New York. Honorable mentions go to Montez Sweat and Chase Young. Both were causing havoc on that Washington D-line. But yeah, very impressive years from those two as well. And my defensive MVP candidate from the NFC North is got to be Roquan Smith. He had an incredible year, the linebacker from the Chicago Bears. We all knew coming into this year he was one of the better linebackers going around, but this year I think he really established himself as one of the very best. He had 98 solo tackles, which was second in the NFL. He had 18 tackles for a loss, which is second in the NFL as well, which is pretty impressive from the linebacker position. You would expect edge rushers or defensive ends to have the most tackles for losses, so very impressive from Roquan Smith. And he was the Chicago defense had another stellar year, and he was another vital reason why that defense ticks so well. Honourable mentions have to go to Za'Darius Smith, who had another cracking year. On the Green Bay D-line, he's been pretty incredible since they've picked him up. Eric Wilson from the Vikings had a pretty good year, and Khalil Mack probably wasn't quite at his destructive best, but he was pretty impressive for most of the season as well. The NFC South, this was a very impressive defensive division in the end. Probably wouldn't have been expecting it going into the year. You would have thought Atlanta and Carolina would have had pretty poor defenses, but in the end, pretty much all four of the teams had good or above average defenses. Not sure if we can say that about Atlanta, but I'll say it. But for me, the MVP nominee is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers linebacker, Devin White. In his second year in the league, he had an absolute blinder. He had a pretty good year in his first year, and I think he had pretty high expectations coming into this one, and he didn't disappoint. Third most tackles for losses in the NFL, third most solo tackles in the NFL, and that whole Tampa Buccaneers defense, they had a few off games, but Devin White was a consistent performer in that linebacker slot, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do in the Super Bowl along with the rest of his Buccaneer defensive teammates, because they're really going to have to trouble Mahomes if they're going to try and win that game. But a lot of honourable mentions have to go out in this NFC South division. It was very competitive, especially in terms of individual defensive players. Levante David, another Buccaneers linebacker, Foysaid Oluokun, not sure if I'm saying that right, from the Falcons, Deion Jones, Jason Pierre-Paul, and Malcolm Jenkins all had very impressive years and were a big reason why the NFC South was pretty good this year. And then in the NFC West, you could probably have guessed it, but it's Aaron Donald. I was actually surprised. A lot of my things are based on statistics, and Jalen Ramsey probably similar to Jair Alexander actually, and I'm sure there was some in the AFC episode, but lockdown corners, unfortunately, they're more of an eye test, a bit like an O-lineman. There's not really stats that back them up that much, because usually they're just locking down a player so the ball doesn't go to them too much. So Ramsey's probably been underappreciated here by me with the stats, but Aaron Donald is my defensive MVP candidate from the NFC West. Finished the year with 13.5 sacks, which was the second most in the NFL, 14 tackles for a loss, 28 QB hits, which was the fourth most in the NFL, and 4 forced fumbles. So pretty incredible stats, and when you factor in he's probably copping a double team on 80% of his snaps, that's pretty bloody impressive from Aaron Donald. We've come to just expect it every week, but we probably need to sit back and take notice of how impressive it is. And honourable mentions go to Budda Baker. He is probably next to the Honey Badger, one of the biggest primetime fiends I've ever seen in defense. He absolutely lit it up whenever the Cardinals had a primetime game. I'm picturing that game against Seahawks where he just went cut loose. But I'll talk about that game later. So he also deserves a big shout out because he had another really impressive year. So the candidates are Blake Martinez, Roquan Smith, Devin White, and Aaron Donald. I'm actually not going with Aaron Donald, which most people probably would go with. I'm not going with Devin White. Sadly, Blake Martinez is a little bit off the pace, but I'm going with Roquan Smith as my defensive MVP of the NFL. Of the NFC, sorry. He had an absolute blinder of a year. In pretty much every stat, it's pretty impressive, so it's tough to ignore. A linebacker having the second most tackles for a loss in the competition is very impressive. And I actually have TJ Watt finishing above him in terms of the NFL defensive MVP rankings, but Roquan Smith is my number 2. So, yeah, incredible year, but also big shout out to Devin White and Aaron Donald because they had very impressive years as well. Moving on to the offensive rookie. Once again, similar to the AFC, there's not too much to choose from in terms of these divisions, but we'll try our best. Luckily for this one, we didn't have the toughest decision picking one. It was clearly out of CD Lamb or Antonio Gibson for the NFC East Offensive Rookie Award. and I've gone with CD Lamb. Although Antonio Gibson was extremely impressive in his first year coming out of college, he was an instant hit as the Washington football team's running back. I'm going with CD Lamb. Similar to Amari Cooper, he dealt with a lot of quarterback situation, didn't have much preseason, and the fact that he was just an instant impact from week one, basically. He superseded Michael Gallup and became their number 2 to Amari Cooper pretty quickly. He finished the year in the top 30 in terms of receiving yards and receptions, and yeah, he made some incredible grabs throughout along the way. So I'm looking forward to see what he can do next year. Hopefully, with a full year with Dak Prescott, we'll obviously wait and see with the contract negotiations what happens there. But yeah, big shout out to Antonio Gibson. I think he missed a couple games as well towards the back end, but he was a big reason why Washington made the playoffs. My NFC North offensive rookie, another sitter, Justin Jefferson. I think I'm realising that the NFC rookies are a lot better than the AFC, but Justin Jefferson, 15th in receptions, 4th in receiving yards, 4th in yards per target. He's a deep field threat with his pace and height and athleticism. He's just a bit of a different cat, really. If you watch him, a lot of wide receivers, they're very structured in the way they just run their routes, and they're almost a bit robotic, but Jefferson, he seems to just move and just feel the route and where the ball basically takes him. And then as soon as he catches it, he's an absolute danger after the catch because he's so lanky and hard to get down, I'd say, and he's fast. So yeah, he was really impressive. To me, he was probably the most impressive rookie of the year. Yes, it was impressive what Herbert did, but Jefferson blew my socks off quite a few times with some of the performance he was putting up. Big shout out to DeAndre Swift as well, who he took a while to claim that number 1 running back throne in Detroit, but once he did, he really shined. And shined, I don't know. But yeah, he had a pretty good year. NFC South offensive rookie, they didn't have a candidate actually. There wasn't too many to pick. I can't even think of an offensive rookie, to be honest. They had the Adam Troutman, backup tight end for the New Orleans Saints. But no, I can't think of anyone else. So we'll leave that one blank. And then on the NFC West side, once again, not too many options, but Brandon Ayuk, I think, had a seriously underrated season. Once again, similar to the Dallas guys, he was dealing with the quarterback change almost monthly. He built up quite a relationship with Nick Mullins, and then CJ Beathard stepped in. So that was a shame, but top 30 in reception and yards per game, only played 12 games, and yeah, he was very impressive when he played. Deebo Samuel and George Kittle weren't there for most of it, and he just stepped up, and you almost forgot that he was a rookie. And I think if it was, I actually honestly reckon Nick Mullins is the reason why his season's going a bit underappreciated. I think if he was on the receiving end of a bigger name quarterback's throwing, I think Ayuk's season might have been talked about a bit more. And the fact that he only played 12 games, I think, means, his volume was a bit depressed, or suppressed. And I think that means that less chat's going to be about him. But I'm very excited to see what he does next year. Hopefully Deebo Samuel gets on the pitch, and interested to see what they can do together. But in terms of offensive rookie, it's got to be Justin Jefferson. Had an absolute blinder of the year. I've got him as the 5th best wide receiver on the year. So for a rookie to do that, that's pretty incredible. He was one of the least talked about high picks in terms of wide receivers. Everyone was talking about Henry Ruggs, CD Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, and Justin Jefferson was just quietly going about his work in the preseason and during the draft periods, and then he just went bang onto the scene from LSU to the Vikings, and he was absolutely loving it with Adam Thielen and Kirk Cousins. So excited to see what he can do next year. Defensive rookies, back to the NFC East, another pretty clear one. Chase Young, 7.5 sacks, 10 tackles for a loss, 4 forced fumbles. He was a wrecking ball from pretty much week 1. We were expecting it. He was talked about as being actually the number 1 player in the draft class. It's just the QB importance meant Burrow went number 1. So everyone was expecting it from Chase Young, but the way he did it so quickly and so effectively, you would expect people to go from bullying college football and then go to struggle in NFL, but he seemed to really have no trouble with that and just started bullying the NFL as well. So Chase Young, incredible opening season in the NFL. NFC North, there weren't many to pick from. Joel Gladney, look, I can't lie, I don't really know who he is, but he is the guy I've picked. Nothing really of note to talk about him. NFC South, once again, nothing outrageous from these boys, but I've gone with AJ Terrell. He was a high pick for the Atlanta Falcons in cornerback position. He had 3 forced fumbles, which I reckon is pretty impressive for a rookie cornerback. But yeah, nothing of note really, apart from the 3 forced fumbles to mention from him. Antoine Winfield and Jeremy Chin also had pretty good years for the Buccaneers and Panthers respectively. NFC West didn't have a defensive rookie candidate, so overall my defensive rookie MVP for the NFC is Chase Young. Not really a shock. He almost actually was the MVP candidate for the NFC in general over Blake Martinez, so yeah, not really surprised that Chase Young's winning this award. And he will be, I think I gave it to Patrick Queen on the AFC side. And I've got Chase Young just pipping Patrick Queen. So Chase Young, can confirm, is my defensive rookie MVP, even though that is not an award, but play on. Looks like it's going to be another short episode here today, but we're into the general awards now. Coach of the Year. This is actually a tough one because I like to look at last year's performance and then look at this year's and see who improved the most as a bit of a gauge for Coach of the Year. And blokes like Cliff Kingsbury and Matt LaFleur were popping up, but I decided to put them aside. And I have 3 candidates here. I think they're all very worthy. Bruce Arians, they were probably the biggest improvers in terms of a team, and they're a chance at winning a Super Bowl. I think if they win the Super Bowl, it might be a different conversation, but I'm probably going to say no to him being Coach of the Year in the NFC just because I think with the roster they had, I think it was more a bit of a GM job building that list instead of a coaching job. But he still did very well to bring them all together as a team and get them playing well by come playoffs time. But the 2 main men I'm looking at here is Matt Rule, the Carolina Panthers coach, and Ron Rivera. I think I'm going to just give it to Ron Rivera, but I'll quickly talk about Matt Rule and his credentials. First year in the NFL, Carolina were being picked as an 0-16 team coming into the year. Everyone thought they were going to be absolutely hopeless, especially on the defensive side of things. And they ended up having a pretty good year. Can't remember their record exactly, but I reckon they had 5 or 6 wins, which was pretty impressive. Teddy Bridgewater, yes, he fell away towards the end of the year, but he was a pretty good pickup in terms of the first half of the season. And yeah, I just think it was a pretty incredible year from Matt Rule, what he got out of this team. They finished 5-11. So it doesn't sound as good as I'm making it out to be, but the fact that they improved on last year and that they had on paper one of the worst teams you'll ever see, especially on the defensive side of things. I think Matt Rule did a very good job in his first year, and I think the Panthers have a bright future if they can. I don't know what they're actually going to do at the quarterback position, whether they're going to draft someone, but I think I'm going to do an episode in the near future about team needs and who they should draft and pick up in free agency, so I might talk about it there. But yeah, Ron Rivera, he took the Washington team to playoffs. It has to be said, if it was a stronger division, that team wouldn't have got there, but I think they got to 7 wins in the end, and they beat teams like the Steelers and stuff like that. So Ron Rivera to get that out of a team on paper that didn't look great, probably looked the worst out of the division. I think that was a pretty incredible effort, especially in his first year with a new team. He obviously had all the off-field drama with his cancer treatment and stuff. It's been announced this morning that he's cancer-free, so well done, Ron Rivera. That's very impressive, very awesome. Very awesome to hear. Looking forward to what he can do with his team next year. They look like they've found one in Antonio Gibson. Terry McLaurin continues his rise. They turned Logan Thomas into a top 5 tight end. Interesting to see what they'll do with the quarterback position, whether they keep Alex Smith under center, they give it to Taylor Heineke, or they draft someone. Once again, we'll talk about that in future episodes, but whoever was under center, whoever was at running back, whoever was in any position, Ron Rivera seemed to get the boys going, and the fact that they made the playoffs is, I think, mainly a credit to Ron Rivera. So yeah, he's my coach of the year in the NFC. Game of the year in the NFC, I've gone with the Arizona Cardinals versus Seattle Seahawks in Week 7. This game, last for the AFC, I kind of did some research and looked at the games and thought about which ones were good, but this one was just stuck in my head. Week 7, this is where the famous DK Metcalf chase down tackle on Buda Baker was, and the Cardinals won in overtime. Zane Gonzalez clutched up. I think he missed a field goal late in the game, and then he kicked one on the siren to send it to overtime, and then he kicked one in overtime to win it. I was looking at the ESPN win probability, and the Seahawks actually were the favourite, as in had over 50% win probability the whole game until overtime. So that's pretty incredible that the Cardinals won in overtime. Wilson and Murray both put on a show. They had over 400 yards combined passing and rushing each. This was when both of them were in elite form. They both had over 3 touchdowns. And this is the game Tyler Lockett absolutely balled out, had like 17 catches or something for 200 yards, 3 touchdowns. And Hopkins also had a pretty good game himself. I think he had like 110 yards and a touchdown. So, yeah, there was a few good games to choose from, but for me, this stood out the most. Both teams were just firing shots at each other. Buda Baker also put on a very impressive performance in one of Arizona's few primetime games that he kind of announced himself to the competition with a few important sacks and an interception. But yeah, incredible game, a lot of memorable moments, so that for me is the number one. Top 3 signings of the year in the NFC. Honourable mention giving to Malcolm Jenkins, cornerback, came from the Philadelphia Eagles back to the New Orleans Saints, who he was previously with, and he returned to some of his best form under the Saints coaching. He had 4 forced fumbles, and he was just impressive all year, really. So I thought I'd mention that. And then number 3, I've talked about him before, but Blake Martinez went from the Green Bay Packers to the New York Giants in that linebacker slot and didn't really miss a beat. You'd thought he was maybe past his peak, but he just showed that he's still one of the better linebackers in the competition. Number 2, I'm going with Tom Brady. Obviously, a high-profile move from the Patriots to the Buccaneers, and he had the 3rd most passing yards of the year, 2nd most passing touchdowns, 3 game-winning drives, 3 fourth-quarter comebacks, and he's on the verge of winning another Super Bowl. So I think them just being in the Super Bowl is already a win for them, in my opinion. But the fact that they're a chance to win it is pretty incredible. And then number 1, I'm going to give it to DeAndre Hopkins. 3rd in receiving yards, 5th in yards per game. He was obviously part of that famous trade, one of Bill O'Brien's, probably, I guess you would say, infamous moments in a trade involving David Johnson. Everyone thought it was outrageous at the time, and looking back on it, it still is outrageous. But Arizona snagged a genuine elite wide receiver, and I think that was a big reason why they push towards the playoffs, really change their offense, in my opinion. So for me, they are the top 3 signings of the year, with DeAndre Hopkins being the number 1. But that's all I've got for you today in my NFL Awards NFC edition. So that's the AFC and NFC done now. If you haven't seen the AFC, feel free to go back and listen or watch it. But yeah, for now, there's a lot more content to come, a lot more cricket content, a lot more NFL content as well. I'm definitely going to be doing a playoffs review after the Super Bowl. I might do it before the Super Bowl, but it'll be later in about a week's time, whether it be before or after, I'm unsure. Then I'm going to be looking at the tennis as that starts to come up, the cycling. I'm going to try and get back on the soccer. And then before we know it, the Australian sports will be starting back up with the AFL and the NRL. So a lot more to look forward to. But in terms of the NFL specifically, I've got a playoff review coming, and then I've probably got a draft preview, free agency preview sort of situation where I look at what team needs what and who they should go for and stuff like that. So, stay tuned to the social media outlets of the On The Ball podcast. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all that good stuff, and you'll be notified whenever there's a new episode, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. But yeah, if you've gotten this far, very much appreciate you listening. And yeah, show your support to the podcast in any way you can. Really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.